welcome to one of the most unsettling stories ever told from the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, drop a comment with where you're watching from and the time you're hearing this. We want to know how far and wide these strange accounts travel. The year was 1908. Thomas Holloway, a respected cartographer from Springfield, Missouri, was sent deep into the Ozark wilderness to survey uncharted land for the U.S. Geological Survey. The job was supposed to last 3 weeks, mapping the area between Taney and Stone counties, a simple task for a man of his skill. But Thomas Holloway never came back. The official USGS report filed that November said only that Holloway failed to return. His camp was later found untouched, his gear neatly arranged, food nearly untouched, and no sign of a struggle. What the report didn't mention was the journal found among his things, a leather notebook filled with increasingly disturbed entries. That journal was quietly removed from public record, sealed in an archive in Jefferson City, and forgotten until 1963, when researchers stumbled across it. The last person to see Holloway alive was Elias Burkhart, who ran a general store in Garber, a small settlement at the foot of the mountains. Burkhart told authorities that Holloway seemed calm and collected as he stocked up on supplies. He said he planned to set up camp in a place the locals called Stillwater Hollow, a quiet valley about 12 miles northeast of town, known for an unnatural stillness even by Ozark standards. What follows is a reconstruction drawn from Holloway's recovered journal interviews with locals after his disappearance and newspaper reports from 1908 to 1912. Some of these details were later confirmed by geological records, unsealed, in the 1960s after a Freedom of Information request by the Missouri Historical Society. Thomas Holloway's vanishing might have remained just another tragic mystery lost in the backwoods, if not for what happened to those who went searching for him. At the time, Holloway was 37, a widower whose wife had died of tuberculosis 3 years earlier. He had no children and was described as quiet, meticulous, and deeply committed to his work. His supervisor, Dr. William Barrett, said Holloway had a rare talent for noticing geographical details that others overlooked, making him invaluable in the Ozarks' rugged terrain. The region then was still one of the most remote parts of the United States. While railroads had begun cutting through parts of southern Missouri, much of it was still wilderness, dense forests, hidden valleys, and endless cave systems that even seasoned woodsmen found confusing. When Holloway's camp was finally found 10 days after he missed his return date, Sheriff Ambrose Coleman reported everything was perfectly in order. The tent was up, the bedding rolled out, his tools arranged neatly, and a pot of coffee sat waiting but untouched. His rifle leaned against a tree, never fired. There were no footprints, no sign of struggle, nothing. It looked as if Holloway had simply stood up and walked into the trees, never to return. On his bedroll lay his open journal. The final entry, dated September 17, 1908, read, "The woods are quiet today. Too quiet. Something is watching from the hollow." His usually neat handwriting was shaky and erratic. Earlier entries had been routine, full of coordinates and descriptions. But starting on September 12th, his tone began to shift. He began noting the strange way sound behaved in the valley he was mapping. Thomas wrote that his footsteps sometimes echoed when they shouldn't, and at other times made no sound at all. The forest, he said, seemed to swallow noise whole. There were no bird calls during midday, a silence so deep it felt alive. Any naturalist would recognize that kind of quiet as wrong, unnatural, almost predatory. By September 14th, his writing shifted further. Between the usual entries about elevation and rock layers appeared unsettling observations, movements caught at the edge of his vision, shapes that vanished when he turned to look. He was clearly trying to maintain the tone of a professional surveyor, but fear had started to seep through the margins. After Holloway failed to return, Sheriff Ambrose Coleman organized a county-wide search, bringing in seasoned trackers to scour the forest. They covered miles of rough terrain, but found no sign of him, no clothing, no blood, not even a footprint leading away from camp. What the sheriff didn't include in his official report, but later surfaced in a personal letter to his brother in St. Louis, was the behavior of the tracking dogs. According to that letter discovered decades later, during the settlement of the Coleman family estate in 1959, the dogs refused to follow any trail. They became restless, doubled back on themselves, then sat down and howled as if terrified of something unseen. By the second day, they were so hysterical the sheriff sent them back to town. The case might have faded into local legend if not for the arrival of Professor James Wickham from Washington University the following spring. Officially, Wickham was in the area to study the region's karst formations, but university records later showed he had been corresponding with Holloway before his disappearance. The two had been classmates at Yale some 15 years earlier and shared a fascination with the geological oddities of the Ozarks. Wickham set up his base in Galena, about 20 miles from where Holloway was last seen. He brought along a graduate assistant named Edward Mercer and hired local guides to explore Stillwater Hollow. The pair conducted soil sampling photography and what Wickham called acoustic experiments to measure how sound moved through the valley. On March 23, 1909, Wickham and Mercer ventured farther into the hollow than ever before, drawn to a peculiar limestone formation the locals called the Whispering Wall, a curved cliff nearly 40 feet high that warped and echoed voices in eerie ways. Their guide, a local named Harlan Thatcher, warned them not to linger after dark. When pressed by authorities later, he would only say, "Folks around here don't go to that place. Animals won't neither." There's a reason for that. Wickham and Mercer ignored his warning. They told Thatcher to return to camp and start supper while they finished their measurements. That was around 4:30 p.m. When they hadn't returned by nightfall, Thatcher waited until dawn before going back. What he found chilled him. Their instruments were still set up, notebooks open, as if they had been taking notes moments before. But both men were gone. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. Thatcher rode back to Galena immediately to raise the alarm. The search that followed lasted nearly 2 weeks, but turned up no trace of them. The disappearance of two respected scientists drew far more attention than that of a lone surveyor. Newspapers across Missouri picked up the story. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran several articles suggesting the men had fallen into an unmapped cave or been attacked by locals, while one reporter, Frederick Palmer, ventured into the Ozarks himself. His reports grew increasingly sensational, hinting that something ancient and dark moved in those hills, something that did not like to be studied. What Frederick Palmer never printed in his newspaper reports but kept hidden among his own belongings was Edward Mercer's lost journal, discovered decades later among Palmer's estate after his death. The pages echoed Thomas Holloway's writings with eerie precision. Mercer described the same strange silence, the same flickers of movement at the edge of sight, and most disturbingly, Professor Wickham's growing obsession with the hollow's acoustics. In one entry dated March 21st, just 2 days before they vanished, Mercer wrote that Wickham had claimed to hear voices inside the rock face. Mercer noted that he himself heard nothing, though the silence around them felt expectant, as if waiting for something to answer. Wickham pressed his ear to the limestone for half an hour, nodding occasionally, like he was listening to someone speak. When Mercer asked what he heard, Wickham replied, "They know we're here now." Mercer wrote that his expression wasn't fearful, just calm, almost as if he'd accepted something inevitable. When the case finally cooled, official investigations concluded the men had likely died in a cave collapse. The university paid out insurance claims, published respectful obituaries, and closed the file. But in the Ozarks, the story didn't fade. Locals spoke of Stillwater Hollow in whispers, their old mistrust of outsiders deepening. Hunters stopped setting traps anywhere near it. Even logging companies avoided the area entirely, leaving its tall hardwoods untouched. The silence, it seemed, had marked that place as forbidden. Then came Carl Denman, a private investigator from Kansas City, known for tackling strange disappearances. In the spring of 1910, he was hired by Elizabeth Wickham, the professor's sister, who refused to believe her brother's death was accidental. Denman arrived in Stone County and began carefully retracing the events surrounding the vanishings of Holloway Wickham and Mercer. Unlike most investigators, Denman didn't scoff at the region's folklore. He treated superstition as coded history stories that hid kernels of truth passed down through fear. As he interviewed old residents, a disturbing pattern emerged. They spoke of something called the Stillwater Silence, said to predate any settlers. This silence, they claimed, wasn't just an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, something heavy and alive that pressed against the mind. Men who lingered too long in it came back changed, hollow-eyed, muttering to themselves, their voices strangely altered. The consistency of these accounts struck Denman as uncanny. Separate communities, isolated for generations, all told the same story. The oppressive quiet, the feeling of being watched, and a distortion of perception that made reality seem to shift around you. Each element matched what Holloway and Mercer had written in their journals. On May 18, 1910, Denman decided to see the hollow for himself. He was guided by an elderly man named Josiah Wendell, whose family had lived in the area for generations. Wendell agreed to lead him to the edge, but refused to go any farther, explaining he had sworn on his mother's deathbed never to step into the valley. Denman brought with him an Edison phonograph, intending to record the strange acoustic effects described by both surveyors and scientists. He set up his equipment at the mouth of Stillwater Hollow, while Wendell waited silently on the ridge above. According to Denman's recovered notes, he made a series of phonograph recordings as he moved deeper into Stillwater Hollow, heading toward the limestone curve the locals called the Whispering Wall. From that point, what happened next can only be pieced together from fragments of evidence and the testimony of his guide. Wendell later told authorities that after several hours of waiting, he heard a single gunshot echo through the trees, sharp and lonely, against the valley's unnatural quiet. Fearing the worst, but bound by his promise never to enter the hollow, he rode back to town to gather help. A violent storm rolled in overnight, delaying the search until morning. When rescuers finally reached the site, they found Denman's gear scattered at the base of the Whispering Wall. The phonograph was damaged, and the wax cylinders, the recordings, were gone. His notebook lay open on the ground, the final sentence breaking off mid-word. What remained of the phonograph's playback mechanism produced faint, distorted noises beneath the hum of the forest, a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like speech, though in no language anyone could identify. Beside the note Denman had written, "The locals may be right. There is something here that listens." They found him about 200 yards away, in a small clearing, standing motionless, staring at nothing. He didn't respond when called, didn't move when touched, only allowed himself to be led away without a word. A doctor from Branson examined him and diagnosed a severe catatonic state of unknown cause. When his condition didn't improve, he was transferred to the state hospital in Nevada, Missouri. For 7 weeks, he remained unresponsive, neither eating nor speaking unless prompted. Then slowly, he began to talk again, though his words came fractured and strange. When questioned about what had happened in Stillwater Hollow, he grew agitated, sometimes violent. The most coherent thing he ever said was recorded on July 12, 1910, by Dr. Harold Winters, the attending physician. "The silence isn't empty. It's full of them. They've been there so long, waiting in the stone, listening through the stone, speaking through the stone. They learned our words from listening to us. They're learning how to use our voices, how to call with familiar sounds. Don't listen when someone you know calls your name in the hollow. It isn't them calling. Denman never recovered. He remained in state care until he died of pneumonia in 1913. The missing recordings were never found. His remaining notes, confiscated by the hospital, eventually ended up in the Missouri Historical Society archives, where they sat untouched for decades. In the years that followed, Stillwater Hollow's reputation turned darker still. The few families living nearby quietly moved away. A timber company that attempted to log the valley in 1915 reported broken equipment, strange compass readings, and workers losing their sense of direction. One lumberjack suffered a complete mental collapse, insisting the trees whispered when struck. By 1920, the hollow was removed from official maps altogether. Locals called it a place between the lines, somewhere meant to be forgotten. The names Holloway, Wickham, and Mercer faded into folklore whispered around campfires as warnings not to go too deep into the Ozarks and never to answer when the woods call your name. For decades, Stillwater Hollow lingered in obscurity, unmarked on maps, avoided by locals, and dismissed as backwoods superstition. That anonymity likely spared it further attention until 1947, when Dr. Raymond Foster, an acoustical engineer from the University of Arkansas, stumbled upon vague references to a whispering valley while studying natural amphitheaters across the Ozarks. Foster's motives were purely scientific. Known for his research on odd sound phenomena, he had no knowledge of the strange disappearances tied to the hollow. To him, the local reluctance to speak about the area was simply a reflection of small-town isolation and folklore. In June 1947, Foster arrived with 3 research assistants and a truckload of recording and testing equipment. They set up camp, roughly 3 miles from Stillwater Hollow, unaware of the unease their presence caused. Locals refused to guide them into the valley or stay after sunset. Those who agreed to work for them wouldn't cross the hollow's boundary, muttering that some places aren't meant for company. Foster recorded these reactions in his notes as examples of rural superstition. Over the next 2 weeks, the team conducted systematic sound tests, focusing on the limestone structure once known as the Whispering Wall. Though Foster never published his findings, his widow later donated his field journals to the University of Arkansas in 1964. What those notes described was unlike anything in standard acoustics. The hollow, Foster wrote, demonstrated what he termed selective frequency absorption. Certain tones vanished entirely when played within its boundaries, while others echoed far louder and clearer than expected. Stranger still were the delayed returns, echoes that came back minutes after the original sound, as if the valley had somehow remembered the noise and decided to replay it later. On June 24th, Foster documented his most unsettling observation. When he struck the limestone formation with a tuning hammer, the sound didn't resonate outward, but seemed to come from deep inside the stone. His frequency readings revealed layered tones that resembled fragments of human speech patterns, almost as if the rock were trying to imitate the sounds made around it. One of his assistants, a man named Matthews, joked that they were teaching the stone to talk. Foster dismissed the comment as nonsense, but admitted it captured something about the experience that unsettled him. As the days passed, his writing began to lose its clinical precision. By July 1st, the tone of his notes had changed completely. Foster described faint voices at the edges of hearing whispers too low to record, yet too distinct to ignore. His team grew restless. 2 assistants complained of insomnia and vivid dreams in which they carried on conversations with people who weren't there. Foster confessed that he himself had become obsessed with the hollow's silence. He began returning alone in the early hours before dawn, conducting what he called perception experiments, sitting motionless for hours, listening to the stillness as if waiting for something to answer back. The last entries in Dr. Foster's field journal, dated July 7th, read less like the work of a scientist and more like the thoughts of someone crossing a threshold he didn't fully understand. He claimed he could hear through the stone rather than merely against it, describing the hollow's silence as pregnant with consciousness. He wrote of making rudimentary contact with beings he called the observers. The next day, July 8, 1947, Foster abruptly sent his team back to the university with their equipment and data, telling them he needed to remain behind to verify certain findings. He promised to follow within the week. He never did. By July 20th, a search was launched. Foster's final camp sat directly at the base of the Whispering Wall. His gear was untouched, his journal open beside his sleeping bag. The last entry trailed off mid-sentence. It makes perfect sense now. The mathematics of it, the patience of it. They've been waiting for someone to understand, to really listen. They've been so alone for so long. I can hear them clearly now, not just with my ears, but with... That was all. The university ruled his disappearance an accident. His notes were archived. His findings, once groundbreaking, were dismissed as inconclusive. The hollow returned to obscurity. By the mid-1950s, the area had been folded into the Mark Twain National Forest, with forestry maps labeling it unstable terrain. Survey incomplete, effectively steering hikers away. Rangers reportedly received unofficial instructions to keep visitors out, citing sinkholes and unstable limestone. And it might have remained hidden if not for a graduate student named Marion Ledbetter. Ledbetter, an anthropology doctoral candidate at the University of Missouri, stumbled on references to Thomas Holloway's disappearance while researching Ozark folklore. Further digging linked Holloway to the Wickham Mercer case and eventually to Carl Denman's investigation. Unlike his predecessors, Ledbetter came prepared. He spent nearly a year gathering evidence, filing FOIA requests for sealed records, contacting historical societies, and interviewing elderly locals who remembered the events firsthand. In a 1963 letter to his advisor, he wrote, "There is a clear pattern to these events. Initial scientific curiosity gives way to obsession, followed by behavioral changes, and ultimately disappearance or psychological collapse. This is either a genuine phenomenon or a kind of inherited regional psychosis perpetuating itself across generations. Either way, it demands study." On June 12th, 1963, Ledbetter entered Stillwater Hollow with two fellow graduate students, David Summers and William Cartwright. They were briefed on the site's dark history, carried modern recording gear, cameras, and sampling tools, and even set protocols to leave immediately if any of them exhibited strange symptoms. For 3 days, the team worked without incident. They documented the hollow's acoustics, confirmed some of Foster's anomalies, and mapped the Whispering Wall. Their recordings at first revealed nothing beyond what could be explained by natural echoes and selective sound absorption. Ledbetter began to suspect the phenomena of his predecessors were simply the product of isolation and suggestion, people hearing patterns where none existed. But on the 4th day, the first crack appeared. David Summers, the team's photographer, claimed he could hear voices hidden in the static of the audio recordings from the previous night. Ledbetter and Cartwright listened, but could detect nothing unusual even after amplification and filtering. Summers grew increasingly insistent, spending hours with headphones, scribbling timestamps where he claimed the voices were clearest. By the 6th day, he had stopped participating in fieldwork altogether. Instead, he sat near the Whispering Wall for long stretches, pressing a microphone to different spots on the limestone, listening as if waiting for someone or something to answer. When Ledbetter confronted Summers about his erratic behavior, the photographer grew defensive, insisting that his colleagues were missing what was really there because they weren't truly listening. Ledbetter, recognizing the dangerous parallel with earlier investigators, made the difficult decision to end the expedition. Summers refused at first, leading to a heated argument that Cartwright later described in his private journal as deeply unsettling. David spoke as if the valley itself had given him instructions. Eventually, they persuaded him to leave, though only after he demanded to keep copies of all the audio recordings for what he called further independent study. Back at the university, Ledbetter compiled a detailed report on the expedition. He expressed concern that Summers' mental state resembled the psychological disturbances documented in previous Stillwater cases and advised that any future research be conducted under strict psychological supervision. Summers, however, withdrew from the graduate program just 2 weeks later. He took a job as a sound engineer at a Springfield radio station, where co-workers soon noticed his growing obsession with ambient static and hidden voices in background noise. In January 1964, he abruptly quit, drove back into the Ozarks, and vanished. His car was discovered a month later, abandoned on a Forest Service road, roughly 5 miles from Stillwater Hollow. Despite days of searching, Summers was never found. The disappearance shook Ledbetter profoundly. Abandoning plans to publish his findings as a dissertation, he instead assembled every document, recording, and transcript into a confidential report submitted to both the University of Missouri and the U.S. Forestry Service. Titled, Acoustic Anomalies and Psychological Effects in Stillwater Hollow. A recommendation for restricted access. The report outlined 6 decades of unexplained incidents tied to the site. Ledbetter urged that Stillwater Hollow be permanently closed to all research and recreational activity. The Forestry Service, recognizing the potential liability, even if skeptical of the paranormal implications, quietly followed his advice. By 1965, Stillwater Hollow was officially designated a research natural area, a bureaucratic term that effectively sealed it off without admitting why. Access required federal authorization, and ranger logs from that period include multiple notations instructing staff to redirect hikers away from the valley. Academic interest faded soon after. Ledbetter abandoned the topic entirely, completing his PhD on Appalachian folk medicine instead, and refusing all interviews about his earlier work. The Hollow might have finally slipped into legend had it not been for one final incident. In the fall of 1968, a freelance journalist named Bradley Compton came across Ledbetter's restricted report while researching local folklore in the University of Missouri archives. Intrigued, he contacted his editor at the Kansas City Star and proposed an exposé on the most enduring scientific mystery in the Ozarks. Compton entered Stillwater Hollow without authorization in late September, armed with a camera and portable audio gear. He told his editor he would return in a week with either a major discovery or proof that the story was nothing more than rural superstition. 3 weeks passed with no word. Authorities organized a search after his editor reported him missing. Compton's car was eventually found at a remote trailhead, locked and undisturbed. Inside were his travel bag, spare film, and a notebook detailing his research plan. There was no sign of his campsite equipment or body. The story made regional headlines for a few days before being quietly written off as another case of a journalist lost in rough country. And with that, Stillwater Hollow fell silent once more. Few people ever connected Compton's disappearance to the long, grim history of Stillwater Hollow. Most of the records that could have drawn those lines, old reports, sealed archives, and lost journals, were scattered across institutions and largely forgotten. When the Kansas City Star printed Compton's obituary in December 1968, it was a short, unremarkable notice. He was presumed dead, the paper said, lost while on assignment in southern Missouri. But what never reached the public was the small package that arrived at the newspaper's offices a month earlier, postmarked from Springfield. Inside were several audio reels and a handwritten note, both confirmed to be in Compton's handwriting. The tapes contained nothing but forest sounds, wind rustling leaves, faint clicks of recording gear. The note was brief, only 3 sentences long. It's not in the recordings. It never has been. You have to be there to hear it. Since then, Stillwater Hollow has remained officially off-limits. The site is fenced off on paper through federal land classifications, its name absent from most modern maps. Rangers still discourage hikers from approaching, citing unstable terrain. But among Ozark locals, the hollow is whispered about as the place where even sound goes missing. Every so often, an academic or amateur researcher rediscovers a fragment of the story. A geological anomaly here, a missing surveyor there. But the full chronology remains fractured, buried in different archives, each holding only a piece of the puzzle. One of the few official attempts to revisit the site came in 1973, when the United States Geological Survey conducted a classified study under the guise of evaluating mineral resources. In reality, the project had been commissioned at the request of the Department of Defense, which was quietly investigating natural environments capable of bending or absorbing sound potentially useful in developing stealth and surveillance technologies. The operation was conducted with unusual caution. No team member was allowed more than 4 hours of exposure to the hollow, and all were subjected to daily psychological evaluations. The report, partially declassified in 1997, noted that the limestone of the Whispering Wall contained rare crystalline structures that resonated at specific frequencies, amplifying or absorbing sound in unpredictable ways. It concluded that the terrain posed unacceptable variables for field research, and recommended against further study, citing factors that may compromise personnel's safety. Nowhere in the released documents was there any mention of the team's audio recordings. Years later, in 2001, a man claiming to have worked as a technician on that project spoke anonymously to a paranormal journal. He said their equipment had captured organized patterns within the valley's ambient noise arrangements that looked deliberate, like speech without words. When asked to elaborate, he refused, saying only, "It didn't sound random. It sounded like waiting." Long before the modern reports, the hollow's legend stretched deep into local folklore. Indigenous oral histories collected in the late 1800s tell of a place where the trees do not speak to each other, and the silence has hunger. Early French trappers called it le vallon, qui écoute, the valley that listens. The earliest written account may belong to a Methodist circuit rider named Ezekiel Harmon, who traveled southern Missouri in the 1820s. In his journal dated August 1823, Harmon described camping near a curious depression where no birds sing and where the night presses close upon the soul. He wrote that he woke before dawn, convinced someone had called his name, though his companions swore they'd heard nothing. Throughout the 19th century, local papers occasionally carried brief reports of missing hunters or trappers in that area. Most were dismissed as accidents or blamed on wild animals or hostile encounters. But taken together, the stories draw a continuous thread through centuries of people drawn into the hollow of voices that shouldn't exist and of a silence that listens back. A closer examination of the region's long, unsettling record of disappearances reveals a pattern too precise to dismiss as coincidence. When plotted against modern maps, nearly every incident from the earliest settler vanishings to the 20th century investigations falls within or along the natural boundaries of Stillwater Hollow. One case in particular stands out: the Keller homestead. In 1879, Friedrich Keller, a German immigrant, purchased a small tract of farmland at the eastern edge of what would later be recognized as the Hollow. County deeds confirm the sale was made at a suspiciously low price, the previous owner eager to rid himself of the property without explanation. Keller, his wife Margaret, and their 3 adult sons spent 2 years cultivating the land. They were quiet, hard-working people described by neighbors as polite but reserved. Their only contact with the outside world came through a nearby general store where they traded produce and livestock for supplies. In the spring of 1881, after weeks without word from the family, the store's proprietor gathered several neighbors and rode out to check on them. What they found was eerie in its orderliness. The Keller farm was immaculate, plowed fields, livestock fed, and the house tidy as if awaiting its occupant's return. Dinner plates sat half-finished on the kitchen table. Beds were made. Horses still stood in their stalls. Yet every member of the family had vanished. Investigators found no evidence of violence or theft, no footprints leading away, no wagon tracks, no signs of struggle. The strangest detail recorded in the sheriff's report was a discovery in the woods behind the property. Dozens of small stone cairns arranged in perfect concentric circles around a limestone outcropping. When dismantled, they revealed nothing. No artifacts, no graves, no hidden structures. The official inquiry stalled, and the farm was left to decay. No one in the county would touch the land afterward, despite its rich soil. By 1900, the fields had been overtaken by forest, the house reduced to splintered timbers. Within a generation, it was as if the Kellers had never existed. Thomas Holloway himself noted the remnants of an abandoned homestead during his 1908 survey. In his journal, he described the lingering arrangement of stone cairns and remarked that they seemed to follow some underlying pattern or principle, not readily apparent. He collected soil samples from the site, intending to analyze them after his return. Those samples, along with Holloway, were never seen again. From a geological standpoint, Stillwater Hollow sits atop some of the oldest terrain in North America. Much of the Ozarks has remained above sea level for more than 300 million years. Its bedrock formed by the accumulation of marine fossils in ancient shallow seas. Over time, these sediments compressed into the vast limestone systems that now shape the region's caves, cliffs, and valleys. But researchers who have examined nearby formations note anomalies that set this region apart. Core samples from the surrounding area reveal mineral inclusions and crystalline patterns inconsistent with typical Ozark limestone. Some geologists suggest that during its formation, the area may have been influenced by hydrothermal vents, ancient fissures releasing mineral-rich water from deep within the earth. These vents could have introduced rare earth elements into the calcium carbonate structure, creating unique acoustic and vibrational properties in the resulting stone. A speculative 1995 paper by an unnamed geophysicist, believed by many to reference Stillwater Hollow, without identifying it, proposed that such crystalline matrices might, under the right conditions, store and release vibrational energy in coherent forms. The theory was swiftly dismissed by the academic community as fringe science. The author later retracted portions of the paper, claiming his work had been overinterpreted and insisting he'd intended no implication beyond natural geological processes. Yet while science dismissed the anomaly, folklore filled the void. In Ozark oral traditions, Stillwater Hollow is a place where the earth remembers. Locals speak of stones that listen, of a silence that grows heavier the longer one stays within it. Some say the cairns found on the Keller property weren't markers at all, but barriers arranged long ago to keep something within the hollow from spreading beyond it. One of the most enduring stories about Stillwater Hollow predates European settlement entirely. According to oral traditions recorded by early 20th century folklorists, a tribal shaman once tried to contact what dwells beneath the world through rituals performed in the hollow. The story says he succeeded, but what answered was something he hadn't prepared for. In this version, the hollow's silence is not emptiness, but presence, a living awareness that emerged from the stone and never left listening, and at times calling to those who stray too far into its domain. Pragmatic explanations have been offered for over a century. Scientists point to the hollow's unusual acoustics, temperature inversions, air density shifts, and the unique contours of the limestone valley, all of which could create what acousticians call sonic anomalies. Infrasound, a low-frequency vibration produced naturally by certain geological formations, is known to induce anxiety, disorientation, and even visual disturbances in susceptible people. These factors could theoretically explain the unease visitors report. But no other place with similar features has produced such a consistent record of disappearances and psychological collapse over so long a period. The hollow's effects appear singular, its influence tied to something unique in that specific ground. In 1975, Dr. Rebecca Lansing of the University of Colorado attempted the first comprehensive timeline of Stillwater Hollow's incidents. She drew on county records, local oral histories, and scraps of forgotten reports. Though her work was never published, her archived papers identify at least 27 documented disappearances between 1823 and 1968, along with numerous cases of people emerging physically unharmed but changed in personality or behavior. Lansing's notes reveal that she had begun charting what she called disturbing temporal patterns in the hollow's activity. In a letter to a colleague, she wrote, "The incidents appear to cluster in roughly 30-year cycles with periods of quiescence between. If this pattern holds, the hollow is entering another active phase." Not long after the university withdrew her funding, Lansing moved to California and refused to discuss her research with later investigators. Her private notes contain recurring references to dreams, in which voices from the stone called her back to the hollow. Her final remark on the subject, scribbled in a margin, reads, "Some things once known cannot be unknown. Some places, once they know, you never forget." After 1968, the public record grows fragmented. The site's restricted status effectively curtailed official documentation. Occasionally, Forestry Service incident reports mention hikers found disoriented or panicked after straying near the unmarked boundary. Internal memos discuss reinforcing warning signs and explaining the area as unstable terrain. But these reports don't reflect the persistent oral histories kept alive by the local communities. Generations of families in the surrounding counties pass down their own warnings, rarely shared with outsiders wary of being dismissed as superstitious. One of the few first-hand accounts to reach researchers came from Walter Simmons, a Stone County resident who worked as a hunting guide for decades. In a 1988 interview, then in his 70s, Simmons described an incident from the autumn of 1977 while guiding a group of deer hunters from Kansas City. The party had drifted too close to Stillwater Hollow near dusk. "I knew right where we were," he recalled, "and I knew we needed to turn back. But before I could say anything, one of the fellows stopped and cocked his head like he was listening. Then he said, 'Did you hear that someone's calling my name?' None of the rest of us heard anything. The woods were dead quiet, the kind of quiet you only get around that place, like the air's too thick for sound to travel." Simmons said the man began walking toward the hollow, ignoring protests. The way he was moving wasn't right, Simmons recalled. It was like he was being pulled forward. His eyes had this vacant look. It took 3 men to physically restrain him. He fought hard, then suddenly went limp. When he came to, he claimed no memory of the episode. Said he felt like he'd been dreaming, Simmons told the folklorist, but couldn't remember what about. He added that such incidents weren't rare, only rarely reported. Taken together, archival records, oral traditions, and first-hand accounts, Stillwater Hollow emerges not as a single mystery, but a continuum. A place where the same elements repeat: silence, voices, disappearance, and a slow, insidious pull on the mind of anyone who lingers too long. Folks around here know to stay clear, Walter Simmons said. It's the outsiders who run into trouble. Sometimes they listen to the warnings, sometimes they don't. The ones who don't, well, not all of them come back out. In the years following the 1973 U.S. Geological Survey mission, official scientific interest in Stillwater Hollow all but disappeared. Whether because of the Forestry Service's strict access restrictions or the ruinous reputation the site had acquired, few researchers dared associate themselves with it. Careers had been quietly derailed, grants withdrawn, and papers retracted. The Hollow's phenomena defied replication, resisted analysis, and ultimately drove away anyone who tried to make sense of it. That silence lasted until the early 1990s, when new ideas in quantum physics and consciousness studies briefly reopened academic curiosity. Dr. Malcolm Blackwood, a theoretical physicist at MIT, known for his unconventional interests, stumbled across declassified government files on acoustic anomalies while researching the quantum coherence of biological systems. Within those records, he found references to Stillwater Hollow. Blackwood never visited the site himself. Instead, he compiled a comprehensive meta-analysis of all surviving documentation, scientific, psychological, and historical, searching for patterns that traditional models couldn't explain. In 1994, he published his conclusions in a small interdisciplinary journal few had heard of. His paper proposed that the limestone formations in the hollow might exhibit macroscopic quantum coherence that is large-scale entanglement effects typically confined to subatomic systems. Under extreme geological conditions, he argued certain crystalline lattices could theoretically maintain quantum resonance across measurable distances. If the human brain did in fact rely on quantum processes, as some fringe theories suggested, then these formations might be capable of interacting with human consciousness itself. Such interactions, he wrote, could manifest as shared hallucinations, telepathic impressions, or auditory phenomena that appeared intelligent. Mainstream science ignored the paper, but among parapsychologists it sparked intense interest. In 1995, a group of researchers specializing in consciousness studies applied for official permission to conduct fieldwork in Stillwater Hollow. The Forestry Service denied their request, citing environmental sensitivity. However, a leaked internal memo revealed another reason. A psychological consultant had reviewed the proposal and warned of high risk of dissociative and psychotic reactions consistent with prior exposure outcomes. Two members of the group, Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist from Berkeley, and Marcus Weathers, a professional sound engineer, went anyway. In August 1995, they entered the restricted zone without authorization. A Forestry Service ranger later reported finding them emerging from the area at dusk. They were pale-shaken and claimed they'd gotten lost while hiking an approved trail. The ranger escorted them out, unaware of what had actually occurred. Weeks later, Weathers gave a private interview to a small paranormal research newsletter. His account diverged sharply from the official version. He said they had carried advanced recording gear capable of monitoring both audio and electromagnetic frequencies. They established a temporary camp near the limestone formation, known as the Whispering Wall, and ran a series of controlled tests over 6 hours. The data we collected was unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of sound analysis, Weathers wrote. The frequency distributions showed rhythmic modulations that didn't correspond to natural sources. It looked organized, almost linguistic, but in no language I recognize. According to his report, the most unsettling discovery came when they began testing how the hollow's acoustics reflected their own voices. We recorded ourselves speaking into the formation, expecting delayed echoes, Weathers explained. When we played the recordings back, our voices returned, altered still ours but layered with additional tones, harmonics, and fragments of sound we hadn't produced. It was as if something was speaking with us, through us. Dr. Chen never commented publicly. Shortly after the expedition, she resigned from her university position and left the country, reportedly relocating to New Zealand. Colleagues who attempted to reach her in the following years were unsuccessful. Weathers continued to study the recordings, convinced they contained patterns beyond simple coincidence. He tried for years to secure funding for another sanctioned expedition, but no institution would touch the project. Eventually, he faded from academic circles, leaving behind only one note in a 1998 interview. "It's not just sound that's alive down there. It's awareness listening, waiting for us to speak first." By 2001, Marcus Weathers had seemingly changed his mind. In a short article published that year, he publicly retracted his earlier statements about Stillwater Hollow, blaming his extraordinary claims on equipment irregularities and the influence of expectation in an environment already rich with folklore. To skeptics, it was a reasonable explanation. To those familiar with the Hollow's history, it sounded like another voice silenced. The next major development came in 2002, when the U.S. Forestry Service began a routine environmental assessment of the Mark Twain National Forest, a survey required by federal environmental regulations. For the first time in decades, researchers were officially authorized to enter the restricted perimeter surrounding Stillwater Hollow. The team assigned to the area included 4 members: Dr. James Harrington, a geologist; Dr. Elena Vasquez, a botanist; Michael Reeves, an environmental technician; and Tasha Williams, a graduate student in ecology. Their mission was straightforward: 5 days of cataloging plant species, collecting soil samples, and documenting any ecological hazards. On the second day, all radio contact ceased. A ranger dispatched to check on their position found the camp undisturbed, equipment neatly arranged, tents intact, meals half prepared, but the team was gone. Within hours, a large-scale search operation began, drawing personnel from multiple districts. 3 days later, Reeves and Williams were located walking along a service road 8 miles from the camp. They were disoriented, dehydrated, and unable to explain how they had gotten there. Neither could remember anything after setting up equipment that morning. The following day, searchers found Dr. Harrington deep within the hollow, seated at the base of a limestone formation. He was alive, but unresponsive, staring fixedly at the rock face. When rescuers tried to move him, he resisted violently, repeating the same phrase over and over. "It's in there. It's always been in there. It wants to come out." He was evacuated by helicopter and hospitalized in Springfield, where doctors diagnosed acute stress disorder and temporary cognitive impairment. Dr. Vasquez was never found. Despite one of the largest search efforts in the forest's history, no trace of her was ever recovered. The case was ruled a probable accidental death, an explanation that satisfied bureaucratic procedure, but not the people who'd been there. Official reports omit one crucial detail: Harrington's personal field journal. Portions of it were anonymously leaked to the Springfield News Leader months later, and its contents were disturbingly familiar. Harrington described the same acoustic distortions noted by Thomas Holloway and others before him. Sounds that vanished, mid-air echoes that arrived out of sequence, and a silence that seemed alive, appraising. In one entry he wrote, "There is something profoundly wrong with the quiet here. It doesn't feel passive. It feels evaluative, as if listening with intent." His final entry hinted at what he believed was a revelation. The limestone isn't just reflecting sound, it's processing it. The crystalline matrices are operating as a primitive cognitive system, storing and analyzing what they hear. It learns. it's been learning for millions of years. The hollow itself is the intelligence we've been sensing, and it's getting better at communication. In the aftermath, the Forestry Service acted quickly. The environmental assessment was suspended indefinitely, and the area's restricted status was reinforced with new signage and increased ranger patrols. Internal documents later obtained through FOIA requests revealed serious discussions about fencing off the entire region. The proposal was eventually rejected officially for budgetary reasons, though some officials privately expressed concern that a fence might draw unwanted public curiosity. Dr. Harrington was released from medical care several weeks later and quietly returned to teaching at the University of Missouri. Colleagues described him as distant and distracted, spending long nights in the geology lab, examining limestone samples from across the Ozarks, but never again from Stillwater Hollow. He refused all interviews, citing a non-disclosure agreement with the Forestry Service. Ironically, those same restrictions intended to bury the story only fueled its legend. By the mid-2000s, online forums devoted to the paranormal began swapping stories about the Whispering Woods and the haunted valley of the Ozarks. Most were distorted retellings of the real events mixed with local ghost tales and internet embellishments. Still, a faint thread of truth remained woven through the exaggeration. Today, Stillwater Hollow exists somewhere between official silence and cultural myth. It's marked on maps only as unstable terrain, no public access. Rangers still patrol the perimeter and turn away anyone who gets too close. Yet every few years, someone tries hikers, urban explorers, amateur ghost hunters. And sometimes, as the locals say, not all of them come back out. Between 2006 and 2018, the counties surrounding Stillwater Hollow reported 7 missing persons cases linked to the forests bordering the restricted zone. 5 of those individuals were eventually found alive, disoriented, dehydrated, and with little to no memory of their time in the woods. 2 others remain missing to this day, their disappearances officially unresolved, despite extensive searches. One of the recovered cases drew national attention for a time. In 2010, 21-year-old college student Jason Merrick vanished after setting out to explore what online forums had begun calling the silence. A sound design major fascinated by the legend, Merrick told friends he planned to record the Hollow's unique acoustic phenomena for a class project. When he failed to return after 3 days, his friends alerted authorities. His car was discovered at a remote trailhead about 5 miles from the Hollow's boundary, his camping and recording gear gone, suggesting he'd entered the forest on foot. After 4 days of searching, hindered by sudden violent thunderstorms, a volunteer found Merrick sitting at the edge of a clearing facing a limestone outcrop. His recording equipment was neatly arranged in a semicircle before him, all of it powered on but silent. When approached, he seemed aware of his rescuers, yet dazed, responding politely, but with little coherence. At the hospital, doctors found him physically unharmed, but severely sleep-deprived and mildly dehydrated. When questioned, his story shifted. Sometimes he said he'd gotten lost. Other times he insisted he had found what he was looking for, but couldn't explain what that meant. When his confiscated recording equipment was returned, deputies asked what he'd captured. Merrick reportedly smiled faintly and said, "Nothing you could hear by listening to the recordings. It doesn't work that way." He refused to elaborate. Over the following months, his friends noticed subtle but permanent changes. He withdrew from social life, changed his major from sound design to geology, and began spending long stretches of time alone in remote parts of the Ozarks. Though he never revisited the Hollow, online users have claimed to encounter him near its outskirts, always delivering the same cryptic warning: trust the silence, but never answer when it calls your name. The most recent verified event tied to Stillwater Hollow occurred in the spring of 2017 and involved someone who should have known better. Daniel Matt, a Forestry Service ranger with over 15 years of experience, vanished while performing a routine patrol along the hollow's restricted boundary. A veteran of the Mark Twain district, Matt was respected for his professionalism and deep knowledge of the terrain. He began his circuit on a clear morning, radioing headquarters to confirm conditions were normal. While in estimating he'd complete his 4-hour patrol by mid-afternoon, when he failed to check in, his supervisor called repeatedly, no answer. Given the hollow's history, a search began immediately. Tracking dogs were brought in, but their behavior mirrored reports from over a century earlier. They caught a scent, grew restless, then turned in circles before sitting down and howling, refusing to proceed further. 3 days later, searchers found Matt nearly 2 miles inside the restricted zone, well beyond where he should have been. He was seated on a fallen log, motionless, staring at a limestone formation resembling the legendary Whispering Wall. His radio had been disassembled, its parts arranged on the ground in a precise geometric pattern, almost ritualistic in its symmetry. When rescuers approached, Matt responded to their questions with single, unrelated words. "Stone listening inside, remember." He was airlifted to a Springfield hospital where physicians diagnosed acute dissociative disorder of unknown etiology. Though he eventually recovered basic cognitive function, he retained no memory of the event. Afterward, the Forestry Service reinforced perimeter security, yet again installing new signage and doubling patrol frequency. But for locals, none of it made much difference. As one resident told investigators, "You can fence it, mark it, and warn folks all you want. But the hollow's been calling people for generations, and sometimes it gets an answer." Over the weeks following his rescue, Daniel Matt slowly regained the ability to speak, though his memory of entering the hollow and the time he spent there never returned. When pressed by Forestry Service investigators, he grew agitated and repeated only one phrase: "It knows we're listening. It's learning how to speak." After 6 weeks of treatment, he was released, but never resumed his position with the service. Former colleagues later said he relocated to the Pacific Northwest, as far from the Ozarks as he could get without leaving the country, and has refused all interviews about his experience, citing both medical privacy and the terms of his separation agreement. Internal documents from a subsequent Forestry Service review of the incident, obtained through a 2018 FOIA request, show mounting alarm among senior administrators. One memo by a regional supervisor reads, "The consistency of psychological effects across more than a century suggests an environmental factor that remains unidentified despite multiple scientific investigations. Until this factor can be isolated and mitigated, the current access restrictions should not only be maintained, but reinforced." Another document outlined plans for remote sensing of the hollow, using technology to gather data without sending people inside. But it is unclear whether those plans were ever implemented. Today, Stillwater Hollow retains its designation as a restricted research natural area. Official maps label it only with the vague notation, "Unstable Terrain Survey, Incomplete." Rangers assigned to the district receive special briefings about the site, briefings whose contents remain off-limits to the public. Yet despite these measures, the hollow's real legacy persists not in official files, but in oral tradition. Families in the surrounding Ozark communities have kept their warnings alive for generations. If the bird stops singing, turn back. If a voice calls your name from deeper in the woods, never answer, especially if it sounds like someone you know. These stories have protected locals for decades. It is outsiders, scientists, thrill seekers, amateur filmmakers who keep getting drawn to the hollow. In the summer of 2018, Rangers intercepted a group of college students attempting to enter the area with recording gear and camping supplies. They said they were filming a documentary about America's most haunted forest for for a streaming platform. They had no idea about the documented disappearances, believing the Hollow to be nothing more than another internet legend. Their equipment was confiscated, citations issued, and they were escorted back to their cars. Before letting them go, the lead ranger gave a single warning. Whatever you think you're looking for in there, it's not worth finding. Some things once known can't be unknown. Some places, once they know, you never forget. The Hollow waits, as it always has. The silence listens. And if the stories are true, it sometimes speaks using voices almost, but not quite like those who have vanished there. So if you ever find yourself hiking the backcountry of the Mark Twain National Forest, and the birds suddenly stop singing if the air grows heavy, with a silence that presses against your eardrums, turn back. And if in that silence, a familiar voice calls your name, do not answer. Do not follow. Above all, do not listen too closely. Because in those woods, the silence has had over a century to learn human voices and plenty of practice using them.